It was Robert's first week working at St. Catherine's Orphanage, and he'd already decided it was the most heartbreaking place he'd ever been. The building itself was old, the kind of old that felt tired rather than charming. The walls were painted an institutional beige that hadn't been updated since probably the 1970s. The radiators clanked and hissed through the night. The linoleum in the hallways was cracked, worn smooth in certain spots from decades of small feet running, walking, sometimes dragging themselves to places they didn't want to go. Robert had taken the job because he needed work. At 23 years old, he'd been drifting, construction work 1 month, retail the next, nothing that stuck. When he saw the posting for a maintenance and janitorial position at the orphanage, he thought, why not? It was steady. It paid enough to afford a small apartment. It seemed safe. What he hadn't expected was that it would break his heart. On his 3rd day, he was mopping the hallway on the 2nd floor when he heard the sound of a child crying. Not the usual noise, kids were always making noise, but the kind of crying that came from someplace deep and dark inside. Robert followed the sound to a room at the end of the hall. The door was open just a crack, and through it, he could see a boy sitting on a bed, alone, with his shoulders shaking. Robert hesitated. He wasn't trained for this. He was just the janitor. It wasn't his job to deal with the kid's emotional problems. But something in his chest twisted at the sight of that small, shaking figure, and before he could think too much about it, he knocked lightly on the door frame. The boy looked up, startled, and quickly tried to wipe his face with the back of his hand. He was small for his age, maybe 11 or 12, with dark hair that fell across his forehead and eyes that had the particular wariness of a kid who'd learned not to trust too many people. "You okay, buddy?" Robert asked, and immediately felt stupid for it. Obviously the kid wasn't okay. "I'm fine," the boy said quickly, his voice rough from crying. He turned away, crossing his arms over his chest like a shield. Robert could have left it at that. He should have. He was just the janitor. But instead, he stepped into the room and leaned against the wall, not quite sitting but not quite standing either. A neutral position. Non-threatening. "Name's Robert," he said. "I just started here." The boy didn't answer at first. Then, quietly, "Daniel." "Daniel," Robert repeated, as if memorizing it. "That your bed?" Daniel nodded slightly. "Room's got a nice window," Robert observed, gesturing toward the single window that overlooked the orphanage's small courtyard. "You can see the sky from here." Daniel didn't respond, but Robert didn't leave. He just stood there, filling the silence with his presence in a way that somehow didn't feel intrusive. After what might have been 5 minutes or might have been 30 seconds, time moved strangely in moments like this. Daniel spoke. "My mom was supposed to visit today," he said to the wall, not to Robert. "She said she would. Last week she promised. But she didn't come." Robert felt something heavy settle in his stomach. He'd been in the system long enough to know how this story usually went. Promises broken by parents who had their own problems, their own addictions, their own reasons for disappearing. Kids left behind, trying to understand why they weren't worth showing up for. "That must be really hard," Robert said, and he meant it with every fiber of his being. Daniel's shoulders shook once, a violent little movement, and then he seemed to clamp down on his emotions, forcing them back down into whatever dark place he kept them. "It's okay," he said with the practiced tone of someone who'd learned to minimize his own pain. "I'm used to it." No kid should have to be used to that, Robert thought, but he didn't say it out loud. Instead, he said, "You like to draw?" Daniel turned to look at him with confusion written all over his face. "What?" "Just wondering," Robert said. "You've got good light here. By the window. Good for drawing. You ever try it?" Daniel shook his head. "There's probably some paper and pencils in the art supply room downstairs. I've seen them." Robert was thinking out loud now, making plans. "Could bring you some if you want." No pressure. Just, if you ever feel like it. Daniel looked at Robert for a long moment, studying his face as if trying to figure out if this was some kind of trick or test. Finally, he said quietly, "Okay." That night, Robert went to the dollar store and bought a set of colored pencils and a nice drawing pad. It cost him about $15, which was more than he could really afford, but something inside him wouldn't let him bring the institutional supplies from the orphanage. Those supplies were fine for school projects and art class, but this was different. This was for Daniel. He left them on the windowsill of Daniel's room the next morning, before his shift officially started, before anyone was really awake. No note. No explanation. Just a gift, placed where the light would catch them first thing when Daniel woke up. When Robert passed by that afternoon, the pad was open, and there was a single drawing on the first page. It was rough and untrained, clearly the work of someone who'd never drawn before, but it was beautiful. It was a picture of the orphanage courtyard, but not as it actually was. In Daniel's drawing, the concrete was covered with flowers, and the sky was full of birds, and there was a figure standing in the center with their arms spread wide, like they were about to fly away. Robert felt tears prick the back of his eyes, and he had to walk away quickly so no one would see. From that day on, an unspoken rhythm developed between them. Robert would leave supplies, new pencils when the old ones wore down, different kinds of paper, erasers, a small pencil sharpener. And Daniel would draw. He drew everything. He drew the other kids at the orphanage, capturing something essential in each face, their loneliness, their resilience, their hunger for kindness. He drew the staff members, and Robert was fascinated by how Daniel saw them, not as authority figures, but as people carrying their own burdens. He drew dreams, surreal landscapes where gravity worked differently and buildings could walk on legs and the sky held colors that didn't exist in the real world. But more than anything, Daniel drew hope. Every image contained some element of it, a window letting in light, a door opening onto possibilities, a figure reaching upward. It was hope of the quiet kind, not desperate or manic, but steadfast and real. 3 months into this arrangement, Daniel came to find Robert in the supply closet where he was organizing cleaning materials. This was unusual. The kids didn't usually seek out the janitor. There was an invisible line between the staff and the children, even among those like Robert who worked in the background. "I wanted to show you something," Daniel said, holding out a drawing. It was a portrait of Robert. Not as he saw himself, rough around the edges, tired, unremarkable, but as Daniel saw him. In the drawing, Robert was surrounded by light. His hands were rendered with particular care, strong and capable. And his eyes held a kindness that made Robert barely recognize himself. "I called it, the janitor," Daniel said quietly. "Because you're always fixing things. But you fixed me. I didn't even know I was broken, but I was, and you fixed me." Robert couldn't speak. His throat was too tight. He took the drawing with hands that shook slightly and looked at it for a long time. When he finally found his voice, all he could manage was, "Thank you, buddy. This means everything." And it did. It meant everything, because for the first time since arriving at St. Catherine's, Robert understood the magnitude of what he was doing. It wasn't just leaving supplies on a windowsill. It wasn't just asking questions and listening to a kid cry. It was telling Daniel, through actions, that he mattered. That his pain was seen and acknowledged. That he was valuable. Over the next 3 years, the rest of Daniel's time at the orphanage, that bond deepened into something that neither of them quite had words for. Not father and son exactly, but something close. A tether. An anchor. A lifeline that held them both steady in uncertain times. Robert became Daniel's person. When Daniel had nightmares, he'd find his way to Robert's small office on the ground floor, and they'd sit in the dark and talk about nothing until dawn started creeping through the windows. When Daniel struggled with math homework, Robert would work through problems with him, admitting when he didn't know something and learning alongside him. When Dan